systems. It's not a, I mean, it's a real danger. And second, actually a related risk is the spillover effect of the internal policy of some countries or some blocks of countries due to, I mean, party friction, due to its internal governance inefficiency. They are having problems, but they try to pass these problems to other countries. They try to make other countries a scapegoat. They make up so-called overcapacity. They make up so-called security risks. If this kind of thing continue, I think the future of the global investment and trade will be quite dim. Way out, I will save that to my presentation. That is a new paradigm of economic globalization, a universally beneficial and inclusive globalization.
Thank you, Mr. Liao. Совершенно справедливо вы...
You were right to say about the growing politicization of international trade. We can use this term to a particular situation, absolute politicization of trade and international economic relations. And what is important that you have noticed, the lack of responsibility and responsible attitude to the behavior in international economic relations, international trade, on part of some countries which impose and try to use the spillover effect of the domestic problem into foreign agenda. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Lee Si-wook.
Your opinion on the issue?
Well, actually, this is the whole point of my presentation, so I summarize as a preview. So, first of all, I don't think that this current situation of a non-cooperative international economic interaction is really inevitable and irreversible, because that is quite depending upon the market. But recently, you can see that the world merchandise trade grew at 7.2%, which is quite high. At the same time, FDI rose by 14%. So, and then still the GDP is quite resilient. So, which means that we are still in process of a de facto globalization. So I think still we have hope, but many things is determined by political side instead of market side. At the same time, if I just think about what is most dangerous at this point is, I don't think that the tariff itself is quite important. But most important, actually, barriers that we face is supply chain race that actually weaponize interdependence, especially in the manufacturing, critical minerals and manufacturing inputs and related technology. So I think those things that will shape our future. So this is kind of preview of my presentation today. And then actually you asked me that the forecast of my institution for the world economy.
That will be later.
Okay.
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 Okay. Здесь действительно...
Yes, there is some proof which confirms the situation is not that dire and gloomy in the world trade and economic cooperation. There are, in some areas, there is growth, but we need to look very, very attentively. Market participants are living and expecting further deterioration of both political and trade political conditions of cooperation, and they may buy some goods and products in advance. And we need to look at the composition of this growth. So there are many things which prove that the main growth accounts for connector countries, which are serving a mediation function under the circumstances of block creation, a fracture based on blocks. And even internal block trade is growing, investment is growing, borrowing and lending are rising compared to the trade between these blocks. I'm talking about so-called alleged blocks, which are defined by the votes in the General Assembly of the UN. But these facts should be taken into account. Thank you a lot, Mr. Lee. And next speaker is Sergei Afontsev with his opinion on the current situation. In brief, please. All distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it turns out that I'm the last speaker at the last session. It will be difficult for me to find new aspects of the situation of analysis. The question whether it is possible to reverse this cooperation capability reminds me of an old joke when the consumer asks the seller whether the apples are tasty, and the seller says they are not tasty by taste, but in fact they are tasty. The same here. There is no growing incapability to cooperate which can be reversed, but in fact it can be reversed. It may be connected with the fact that we see economic factors and the opposition to the trends which can be witnessed on behalf of countries, in the group of countries which are not all right with these trends. But in the short and midterm, there is nothing optimistic on my side. Over these 2 days, we have heard a lot of elaboration on tariff initiatives of Trump, how these tariffs disrupted global trade, how they're going to have further impact on the whole situation. But nobody has mentioned, even once, another important condition or phenomenon which will create a new disruption to the world trade next year is the cross-border carbon tax by the EU, which will have an detrimental impact on all the supply chains, participants of which are connected with the trade with the EU. From my standpoint, this is going to be even a bigger thing than the tariff initiatives by Trump, since tariffs with Trump can be discussed. Our Korean colleagues conducted serious negotiations, and they put aside some of the risks associated with these tariff initiatives. The EU is not willing to talk to anyone. They will say, you do it this way, or we will punish you. How to tackle this problem? I will probably try to cover this issue during my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Sergei. We have heard different angles, but the position of the stance of our speakers is very close to each other in short term, long term, and mid term. So the negative processes connected with the incapability to cooperate in economy will stay with us. It's difficult to mitigate these things, but if we look ahead into the future, there are many factors which will work to lower this fragmentation, both in trade and investment. But many things will be determined by the political situation, by the political will of major players in the investment and economic domain. So we're getting down to main parts of the presentations. I suggest the speakers share their comments on the topic discussed at the angles they want to use. One of the key questions in the impact of trade and investment barriers and risks to the prospect of the global economy, which is, to be honest, is not in the best shape, even without those barriers and risks. There are too many risks which have downward pressure. And I would like to give the floor to answer this question, and for the general presentation, when it comes to barriers and risks to the global trade and investment, to Alexander Shirov.
Thank you so much. First of all, I must say that the economic situation we find ourselves in is related to the fact that this lengthy, almost 30-year-long globalization has come to its natural end. The proceeds that the developed nations got now attenuate, and this was especially obvious after the global financial crisis of 2008. Along with that, we got a situation where the economic might of the biggest economies matched the economic might of the biggest developing nations. And this triggered conflicts in the economic and political spheres. The question is where the global economy has to move, in what direction. That fragmentation or regionalization of the global economy means reducing the global export growth pace, and foreign trade has to grow slower than the global GDP, along with the associated slowdown in the global economy. But on the opposite, we see that there is now a dramatic slowdown in the global economy. More than that, the growth pace is much above than expected. In my opinion, this is an effect of that mismatch between the countries, such a kind of a fragmentation. That fragmentation is associated not only with the change in the trade flows, it is associated with the structural shifts in production, formation of profits, pricing in the biggest economies of the world. Such structural shifts, the effect on the economic growth compensates for the losses that may emerge due to the slowdown of the global economy, so the structural component of the economic growth now benefits the economic development and economic growth. But in my opinion, this is a temporary thing, and while that fragmentation exacerbates, bring about new centers of power centered around the United States or China or the global south, then that structural factor will become less significant, and the global economic growth may really slow down. But now this is not a matter for short term or for the mid-term. What are the key risks of such a scenario of the global economic development? In my opinion, most material is the risk of reduction of the economic growth efficiency. Until today, all those 40, 30 years of globalization, the R&D investments would bring about major increase in productivity, especially in the developed nations. And that rise in the efficiency was the main driver of the global economy. But now, the fragmentation means, and we see fragmentation not just in terms of the supply chains or the trade. Fragmentation concerns also the R&D investments. It means that we see a lot of overlapping of the results, and it means that efficiency goes down. After the global financial crisis of 2008, the reduction in the efficiency of the R&D investment has become obvious, both for the developing nations, developed nations, and for the whole global economy. And the second reason behind the reduction of the efficiency, this is a major bias in terms of R&D investment for the benefit of digital technologies. Yes, digital technologies is our life, and they help to boost the productivity, but whatever we produce from the materials from the real sector of the economy. Development of real economy technologies now actually is underfunded because most of the investments go to digital technologies, artificial intelligence, etc. So no one says that this should not be done, but that mismatch, that disproportion affects not just individual countries or some economic sectors, but it impacts global economy. And this is the second problem that we'll have to face. And finally, if we look at how that fragmentation may evolve in future, then certainly, and as I said before, sooner or later, we will see that the set of global problems would be so much heavy that cooperation, integration, and agreements would be absolutely needed in order to overcome those issues and problems. For instance, if we have to adapt for the climate change, it becomes obvious that neither the United States or China make up with that alone. And besides, such problems actually concern poor countries, and there are no instruments to address that there. So that's why I believe that sooner or later cooperation would be needed. And last thing, that's about Russia. Under such circumstances, we have to understand how to pursue our foreign policy. Bear in mind that the foreign trade is the key restriction for our economic development. In that context, we have to have very well-developed relations with all poles of economic might or centers of power. Attempts to get incorporated into supply chains because of our produce, farming products, our energy, our transport. This is the way that can support the development of the Russian economy. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexander. So you have raised a very vast array of problems for Russia now. Certainly, we live through a very critical period of fine-tuning and specifying our foreign policy. Certainly there are opportunities, but there are challenges there as well. We see a high concentration, geographic concentration of our partners that goes naturally, but that creates a lot of problems. And we see some problems in terms of diversification of our export. It is exacerbated by some logistics issues and settlements and access to remote markets. So lots of challenges. We have a lot to offer in terms of a comprehensive offer. We can make comprehensive offer in terms of security, food security, climate security, epidemiological, cyber security, food security, physical security, by the way, in case of some natural calamities. And we do hope that such a comprehensive offer would be accepted very warmly by our partners. Then let's move next. Our next speaker, Mr. Liao. But before I pass the floor over to you, let me make a kind of a disclaimer. It becomes obvious that now that the United States is forcing down its interests, and it poses most of the risks for the global economic system. And let me list those threats, and probably we will react to that somehow. I mean, the incumbent U.S. administration tries to solve all the current problems by force in detriment to the interests of other countries, and without complying with the international law and the situation in the markets. Then resurrection of the new Monroe Doctrine. So it states that the competitors beyond the Western Hemisphere should not control the strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere. So that's a stretch. that really too much. Then the United States promotes through bilateral practices some limitations for the competitors from the third countries, for the third parties. Probably you're familiar with the latest bilateral trade agreements with Bangladesh, with Indonesia, where there are provisions that directly envisage the priority of the United States in terms of supplies. So the United States should enjoy priority. It means that the U.S. standards have to be imposed, the safety and security standards have to be complied with, a priority in terms of access to the development of natural resources. And that list is quite long, the list of those provisions that not only comply with the spirit of the WTO, but actually is totally contrary to the fair trade principles. The United States seeks to get control using all the potential leverage, control over the critical mass of strategic resources such as crude and gas and Greenland. That's potentially 40% of available critical resources stock. And all in all, that sounds very alarmist. And if it goes on like that, the world would be less eager to cooperate. As far as other countries will have to reciprocate to that, providing for their interests. Mr. Liao. In your interview to Rossiyskaya Gazeta in December 2025, you said that amid the rise of protectionism, it is the open market of China that becomes the main factor for maintaining favorable mutual interdependence. How do you assess the Chinese market potential as a stabilizer of the global economy? Can the growth of the Chinese import compensate for the negative ramifications of the trade fragmentation and less openness of the global economy? Is it not too much for China? But you already commented on that topic, so I will have a very specific question to you. And then you can certainly share your opinion on the topic of our session. So over to you.
Thanks, Chair. I hope this works. And the new slide? Oh, yeah, it worked. Okay, thanks, Chair. Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor and pleasure to be invited to attend this wonderful event, this Primakov Readings event. And I'm also quite honored to be able to participate in this panel. As we have, I guess, as we all noticed, and as my colleagues have already pointed out, the world today it doesn't like me. Okay. Global trade and investment are currently facing numerous obstacles, risks, and uncertainties. Unilateralism and protectionist measures are undermining the well-being of people worldwide. And as His Excellency Lavrov has mentioned just now, economic globalization is confronting an unprecedented crisis. So in the face of this, we advocate for promoting a new mode of economic globalization, that is globalization universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization. Due to the limited time, I would like to share my views briefly in 3 points. First, what is a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization? Well, a universally beneficial and inclusive globalization is a approach fundamentally different from the old one, which were dominated by a few countries and which was characterized by severe imbalanced distribution of benefits. So universal beneficial means that the dividends of globalization should be widely shared, not only flow into a few of developed countries, transnational capital, or specific interest groups. This implies fairness in global market and rational allocation of development resources, so that economies at the lower and middle ends of the global value chain can achieve industrialization and modernization through participation in the global division of labor. And inclusive means the global economic governance system should respect the development autonomy of all countries. It acknowledges the diversity of the world and opposes so-called small yards, high fences, or bloc confrontation based on ideology. It allows countries with different social systems and civilizations to engage in constructive cooperation within the same multilateral framework, seeking common ground through dialogue and consultation. So, in short, a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization is a paradigm of global economic governance that features or focuses on human development, fair competition, and shared prosperity. This is my first point. Point two, why is it necessary to promote a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization today? Well, three points within this point. First, the inherent dilemmas of the traditional globalization model need to be dealt with. Under the old model, a few developed countries dominated the setting of international trade rules. Through intellectual property barriers, technological blockades, and market entry thresholds, developing countries have been long trapped in a cycle of raw material exports and low value-added manufacturing. Meanwhile, the structural changes in labor market brought about by globalization have caused severe social fractures within developed countries. The hollowing out of the middle class, the waves of working class unemployment have fueled populism, which has again given rise to repeated anti-globalization backlashes. The old model of globalization is simply no longer sustainable. Second, as I have mentioned just now in my answer to Chair's question, pan-securitization of economic issues endangers global governance. We can see escalating protectionism, unilateral sanctions, and the abuse of the so-called de-risking measures are threatening to replace the rule-based global economic order that features free trade and interdependence with a zero-sum gaming focused on national security and strategic competition. This transition actually has unleashed a complex crisis. It erodes global economic growth while inflating costs for everyday consumers. It hinders the industrial advancement of developing countries through restrictive technological barriers. And by paralyzing, actually, multilateral institutions, it undermines the collective capacity of humanity to tackle those real global imperatives, such as climate change and food security. Third, a new wave of technological revolution and the green transition are introducing new structural risks. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn the page. On one hand, leading countries are somehow establishing a knowledge hegemony through proprietary algorithms, data dominance, and patent modes, which effectively lock developing countries out of high-end value chains. On the other, the green transition is increasingly being weaponized as some countries leverage tools like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, to impose green barriers, placing an unfair burden on developing countries, which are still navigating their industrialization and transitioning away from fossil fuels. So this brings me to my third point. How should we promote a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization? Well, as the old saying goes, easier said than done. We have to take concrete actions. The Global Development Initiative, or GDI, introduced by China in 2022, and actually has garnered broad international support, particularly from the Global South, offers a comprehensive roadmap toward this end. In my understanding, there are three pillars to this initiative. First, to establish a development priority. The GDI calls on the international community to bring development back onto the center of global macro policy framework. Countries should work together to reach a consensus on development exemptions, which means to suspend sanctions and trade restrictions when addressing essential humanitarian needs, such as food security, public health, and poverty reduction. By establishing a livelihood priority list, we may effectively insulate the real economy from the whims of geopolitics. And second, to seek pragmatic cooperation. The GDI advocates for an action-oriented approach, translating development goals into concrete outcomes that improve lives. I think we should deepen hard connectivity in infrastructure and soft cooperation in digital education and vocational training. We should break the monopoly of transnational capital over high-end segments of global value chains. We should enable developing countries to improve living standards through global division of labor. Last but not the least, to promote inclusive governance. The GDI promotes the principles of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits. It encourages countries to pursue green transitions and technological upgrading tailored to their own conditions, rather than being forced to adopt one-size-fits-all paradigms. Through such equitable dialogue, we can ensure that the rulemaking of international economic globalization accounts not only for the technological standards of the global South, but also for the employment and welfare needs of the global South. So, inclusion, promoting a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization essentially means bringing globalization back onto a right track of serving the well-being of all humanity. This brings me back to the question raised by the chair at the very beginning. Is the current trend reversible? My answer is yes, but it requires the major powers to lead by example, and it requires all the countries to work together. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Mr. Liu, thank you very much for a very comprehensive vision of the ways and trajectories into the future, how to revive the benefits of globalization, cooperation, the ability to cooperate within the international community. Thank you very much. We will have some time for Q&A. We'll be able to ask these questions and discuss this approach. A very interesting approach, by the way. And next speaker is Mr. Lee Si-wook. Mr. Lee, in your comment to the May forecast of your institute concerning the prospects of the world economy, you pointed out that the forecast for the global growth at 3% shouldn't confuse anyone, since the fundamental factors of the economic development, global economic development, are worsening. What, from your standpoint, is the biggest threat to the long-term global economic growth? Cyclical shocks, inflation, debt problem, decline in consumer, or structural institutional process connected with the geo-economic fragmentation, trade barriers, and change in global added value chains. And of course, any opinion of yours on our today's topic. Please, over to you.
As you said, our institution usually make a world economic outlook, like IMF and the World Bank. And this way, we have updated our this year's economic outlook. And our forecast is saying that this year, world growth rate will be around 3%, which is 0.4% lower than last year. And whenever we actually published this, outlook, and we usually make the keyword, and this time we characterize the recent development in the global economy as overlapping shocks and narrowing pathways, noting that the energy and the trade and the fiscal shocks are increasingly actually intertwined with each other. So in global economy, any structural instability is not actually driven by a single shock, but that this is the interaction of this energy, trade, and the fiscal aspect is all together. But still, we are very cautious that there are also downward pressure on the global economy. So first one is, what if energy prices actually still maintain quite high, even though this, U.S.-Iranian war is at the end? So that pretty much affects lots of countries. And second is naturally the uncertainty surrounding trade policies, especially from the United States, and how they actually used the tariff policy and actually expanded them to some other sectors, such as semiconductors and etc. And third one is actually heightened volatility in the global financial market, because many countries are actually during the recession period over the last decade, they spend a lot of fiscal money, so they pretty much suffer from this the public debt situation. So that actually confined their ability to adjust to every shock. So I think these are the downward pressure in the world economy right now. So if I actually look at the more long-term perspective, so as I said earlier, so I'm going to just talk about briefly the two actually important questions that I already a little bit brief. So first one is whether the current trend toward the non-cooperative international economic interaction is inevitable and irreversible. And the second question is, which trade and investment barriers are most dangerous under the current situation, and what do they mean for global economic development? So let me begin with the first question. So given this intensifying strategic rivalry and the widening trade protectionism and also the persistent geopolitical conflict, so nowadays many observers are saying about the structural break or deglobalization in the global economy. So the concern is that international order is being reorganized around the rivalry rather than the cooperation, and that this process may become difficult to reverse. But as I said earlier, the evidence so far points to a nuanced conclusion. So recent data indicate that cross-border economic integration has remained more resilient than many expected. So trade growth is pretty much strong, and still the appetite is hanging around. So usually we actually compare this figure with the figures in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but later that period is quite exceptional because China actually involved heavily in the global value chains, and we have lots of quite vital global chain networks. But nowadays, actually, trade growth in the 7.2% is quite, we can say that quite strong. And at the same time, global supply chains is actually accurately and resiliently adapting through regionalization, digitalization, and the diversification. For this reason, I would argue that the current moment, the current condition is better understood not as deglobalization, but as reconfiguration. So geography of globalization is changing, as well as the composition of trade and investment. And while interdependence is increasingly managed through the language of security and the technological sovereignty, but still interdependence itself has not disappeared. So in my view, so this means that the present trajectory is serious, but not irreversible. It is contingent rather than fate. And the next phase of the international economic order will be shaped not by market force alone, but as you know, by political choice. Therefore, much will highly depend upon how governments actually interpret the situation and how far they choose to weaponize interdependence, and whether they can build guardrails to prevent strategic rivalry from sliding into broader fragmentation. That brings me to the second question. So under current conditions, most dangerous barrier is not just conventional tariff threat, but the barrier arises from the supply chain race that weaponize interdependence, especially in the critical minerals, manufacturing impact, inputs, and related technologies. So most consequential barriers today are those that target not simply trade at the border, but the strategic choke points on which production systems depend upon. These barriers are more dangerous than traditional tariffs for following reasons. First, they can trigger cascading disruption across the entire production ecosystem. Tariff may raise the cost, but choke point restriction can interrupt production itself. And second, they intensify strategic coercion, economic coercion, by turning asymmetrical dependence into political leverage. And third, they narrow the development space available to the countries that do not control critical inputs and advanced technologies. So countries without control over strategic inputs, access to advanced technology ecosystem, or fiscal capacity to subsidize the resilience may find themselves under growing pressure between these competing economic and security blocs. And I would add one more point here. Perhaps most pervasive barrier is uncertainty itself. Recent Bruegel analysis suggests that the trade restriction and the policy uncertainty can damage foreign investment more than previously assumed. And uncertainty alone may, in some cases, have an even larger effect than the restrictions themselves. So it is new barriers emerging from the supply chain race may hardwire asymmetry into the next phase of globalization. If that happens, the world economy will not simply become less efficient, it may also become less inclusive in the developmental terms. So let me conclude a more cautious note. So trend toward greater non-cooperation is real, and the risk should not be underestimated. But the evidence also suggests that globalization remains more resilient than many of current headlines imply. I think the term irreversibility is a dangerous metaphor. Labeling current trends as irreversible is not only analytically dubious, but also it is normatively and statistically problematic, because it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And insisting on irreversibility can impede the emergence of a pragmatic coalition for restraint. So if policymakers and the public internalize the idea that non-cooperativeness is the only possible trajectory, they will be less inclined to invest in institutions, norms, and confidence-building measures that could soften and reverse it. In that sense, the language of inevitability or irreversibility narrows the perceived policy space and debates toward fatalism. So for that reason, I would submit that the key issue before us is not whether globalization is ending, but what kind of globalization will emerge from the period of a strategic rivalry. That outcome, I believe, remains widely open, and it will depend to significantly extend the policy choice of each government. Thank you very much.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. You raised a very important matter of the current development. You were right to focus on the fact that the matter of the future of international cooperation is still open. Much depends on how the political situation will unfold, how the economic situation will unfold. You were right to mention that modern risks are intertwined and interconnected and have a cascade effect. You cannot impact any specific and mitigate any specific risk, expecting that everything will change for the better. It's not that easy. It's not that simple right now. So the strategy of this risk management should be aiming at finding out the interconnected risks, and those risks which we can manage through specific mechanisms and change the ramifications of this cascade effect along the whole risk chain.
To share his comments on the topic of the session. In the recent years, we actively discussed the climate protectionism in the EU, and Sergei spoke about that already, and how it impacts the trade and economic interests of the third parties. What is your take on the situation in that area? Would you elaborate on that? And the second question is about BRICS. Can BRICS countries propose new initiatives that would serve as the foundation for the mutually beneficial economic cooperation amid the erosion of the global rules and institutions? Quite recently, 10.5 years ago, the Ministry for Economic Development of Russia announced that it completed the concept of BRICS exchange. I do think that this is a very important area of our work. Otherwise, we'll have to look up at the pricing policies that are set not by BRICS nations. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with your permission, I will incorporate my answer into my presentation because the answers would sit very well with the text of my presentation. I'm very grateful to Director General Liao Fan for speaking in every detail about very fruitful ideas regarding providing for cooperation internationally. And therefore, I will focus more on the questions related with how to address the lack of cooperation. As I said, my stance, my position is that the lack of cooperation, unfortunately, is here to stay for a while. And this is because the root causes of the lack of cooperation is of long-term nature. There are two factors that sponsor that. First of all, these are the political factors on the one hand, security and control over key resources and technologies. This is what Andrew was speaking about. And secondly, the key instruments to achieve political goals. And the key instruments, these are the economic sanctions. In the economic sanctions, this is not about achieving any economic goals, but rather this is an economic instrument to achieve your political goals. So the critical reason for sanctions to be imposed, this is the damage to be done. So the sanctions do economic damage to the country recipient of those sanctions, not to damage the economy, but that the economic damage could impact the political decision-making. That's why when sometimes people say, look, the Western sanctions are so efficient that they curb the economic growth in Russia. And it means that either the person is telling lies or he's silly, because actual efficiency of the economic sanctions is measured by the change in the political decision-making. If a major damage was done to your economy, but it didn't do anything for the political decision-making, so it means that they're not efficient. So this is like actually a fisherman throws a net and says, I've caught some fish, and the net is empty, so what you have thrown, this is what you got. So the political decisions have not taken. That's why. How many sanctions are imposed against us? They have zero efficiency because no political decisions have been changed. But still, the West relies on those sanctions, and our opponents are not going to abandon those sanctions. And the same is true for Belarus, the same is true for Iran. So that's a long-term factor. Economic and political reasons. The very first reason, that's about less competitiveness of the developed nations. They try to keep their positions, coming up with new limitations and restrictions for the countries that are snatching the sales markets away from them. And the protectionism in Europe is about that. So the Europeans try to come up with some instruments in order to save their inefficient and cost-intensive economy. The first round of that environmental optimism was when developing the green policy, they started supporting the renewables. And remember the publications in the European newspapers that said that now we are transiting to the renewables and will become the leaders in that sphere. And we're going to generate and will produce equipment for the renewables, and everyone is going to buy it from us. And the experts laughed at that and mocked that, and very right so, because 2 years after, it turned out that the whole actually market of equipment for renewables was the Chinese one. So this is the way Europe supported the Chinese manufacturing, and our Chinese partners took advantage of that. Now, the Europeans try to use the same arguments in terms of the carbon tax. So the carbon tax would somehow boost the global majority. So if you want to export your products to us, you have to pay tax, and our companies are losing the markets. What can I say? So there are zero arguments to support that. you cannot say that the European Union has the best standards. And His Excellency, Mr. Minister, made reference to Kipling. And our Russian colleagues probably remember our Soviet cartoon about Mowgli, Jungle's Book by Kipling. You remember that the apes and monkeys are jumping and say we are the most beautiful, we are the bravest, and we are the ones who say that. So that's the main argument of the European Union. So they say that we have the best standards in the world because we say so. So let them believe in that themselves. But such an argument is not convincing to us. But what we can do in such a context? The global history tells us that there is only one strategy how to address the lack of cooperation. It's called in the game theory tit for tat. Sometimes it's translated as a tooth for tooth, but this is much more complicated because it might be a jaw for an eye or it might be an eye for a tooth, but the beginning of the strategy is totally different. So the tit for tat strategy means that first you make some cooperative moves. So sanctions or tariffs actually are imposed against you and you offer some equal terms for trade. If the opponent actually reciprocates with another cooperative move, then you reciprocate with another cooperative. So this is a symmetric answer strategy. So you respond with cooperation if the opponent is ready to cooperate and vice versa. So if the opponent refuses to cooperate, then you do actually non-cooperation move and you try to inflict most of the damage to the most vulnerable spheres that are critically important for your opponents. So a conventional example, just a textbook example. Last year, that was the Chinese case. Remember last April, Donald Trump said, "We're going to make China pay for all those years when there was the trade surplus in our trade with China. Now we will push away the Chinese companies from the U.S. market." What China did? So first, China suggested to start negotiations, and the Americans said, "No, we are not interested in negotiations. Follow what we do, or what we say." And China didn't do anything in terms of tariffs. It just set an embargo on the export of rare earth materials to the United States. And the United States could not do anything about that. Not all the economists, unfortunately, understand that, but this is just about extrapolating the global politics methods to the global economy. So Iran was bombed, and it blockaded the Strait of Hormuz and said, and if you escalate the situation, we will cut the underwater subsea cables, and we are free actually to send your data by pigeons. And that's it, and it immediately triggered the negotiations process. So once Iran hit a very vulnerable area, not all the countries certainly may have such a leverage in order to hit the most vulnerable, the weakest zone. But you may actually align with the countries that have some potential. You can fight against bad guys altogether. BRICS can do a lot about that. Russia filed a protest to WTO against the green protectionism in the EU, and a dozen of more countries are going to file lawsuits to the WTO first. That would be an implication to hold consultations, and if the EU would resist, that then actually it would be submitted to the dispute resolution body, and it was blocked immediately by the United States, immediately when China won several cases against the United States. But the application was submitted, and while it's not considered, the countries are going to ignore all those crazy things that the EU introduced against us and other countries. What are the limits of escalation? So, if you respond with tit for tat, but to what limit you can reciprocate? So actually there are no limits. And as was said by Andrei Spartak, we don't have nuclear bombs in the economy, and we can escalate as much as we want. Sadly, you can ask, what about the global responsibility, and what about the goodwill? The Bible doesn't say anything about that. So why should we why we should react to such arguments? So we align into coalitions, we come up with our own formats how to settle down the disputes once they emerge between us, for instance, within BRICS member states or within BRICS Plus. If other countries resort to that mechanisms and once they have some disputes with us. But those who do not recognize alternative mechanisms or the WTO. So the fight remains the fight. So if we want to have a doomsday, let it be. We have our national interests, and this is what we're going to do. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sergey, I have a question to you. At the very first session, Mr. Graham spoke about the ideas of a competitive coexistence. Can it be exactly the exchange of cooperative moves? Any institutional mechanism, any institutional principle that is seeking to find cooperative moves, actually this is something that encourages cooperation. In essence, cooperation is reversible. This is what been said. This is one more initiative in that sphere. For instance, BRICS, that's another initiative to boost cooperation. So once we have a critical mass of such cooperative initiatives, then actually there will be no shortage of cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear participants, dear guests, we have some time for 2 questions, I think. Any questions from the floor? Any questions to our panelists? The topic is very broad, is very general, but very acute. By no means less pressing than the military and political conflicts. Okay. I don't see any immediate questions. Yes, you can share your comment. A few words about protectionism. As far as we can understand the current situation, protectionism, this is an inevitable element of the global economic fragmentation. The sanctions, this is just one of the elements of tariff or non-tariff barriers in the trade. Just like any other process, we are going to go to certain limits, to push the limits, when unless it becomes obvious that the damage done by the protectionism and sanctions is absolutely unacceptable, intolerable. And we are very close to that very limit, because the United States, first and foremost, is using protectionism in order to protect the chunk of the global trade that they believe they're entitled to, what the US administration does. That's a recognition of inevitable fragmentation in the global trade. We just have to live through that situation, survive through that, because those cooperative steps or moves that Sergey was speaking about would inevitably occur. The intolerable economic damage done by the sanctions now comes afore. Although initially the rise of protectionism certainly would happen in Russia, should not be shy of doing anything about that. Otherwise, we'll be the loser. Look at the scientific and technological development. If we do not protect certain elements of our domestic markets, we should not expect more investments into the Russian R&D. This is my position. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you're absolutely right, saying that at the initial stage, the escalation of fragmentation was boosted by the reforms within certain countries that accelerate the economic growth, and the technological decoupling initially may act as a driver, but only for a short term. Dear panelists, would you share any comments, Mr. Liao, Mr. Siwook? And please be very, very brief.
If you look at the grand tapestry of history, then usually hegemon powers usually maintain the equilibrium through the right balance of incentive deterrence, so stick and carrot. The problem now from the U.S. is only have a stick instead of a carrot. So if we are actually looking at the more cooperation in the future, then I think it could be either China or Russia or India or some of the BRICS country that just design that what kind of incentive system they can offer to other countries. Just a simple calls for the other countries to uphold the free trade order without providing those mechanisms is actually unconvincing and unsustainable. So we are in the stage that the power change, and what we are missing is actually carrot instead of stick. So I think that's one of the things that I like to mention. And the other thing, one more thing is recently the Korea and especially Taiwan actually experienced actually quite high economic growth because of this AI actually boom, because those countries are producing the semiconductor that actually needed for this AI. But problem is we are actually facing K-shaped growth, which means that this benefit is only concentrated on the small number of sectors and firms. Korea's stock market actually tripled this year, but this is all actually driven by Samsung and SK Hynix that produce HBM. And I think the Taiwan case is more striking. Taiwan, last year, the growth rate was 8.5%, which is really high. But problem is private consumption grew only 1%, which means that this benefit is concentrated to the only small group. And I think that definitely affects political choice. So I think this is one of the issues that each and every government should pay attention. How we can deal with this AI revolution and that the implication to the labor market and the income distribution.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Sergey was first. I'm sorry. Sergey, no took minute.
1 minute for your answer. Yeah, sure. I'd like to support Alexander about unacceptability of costs. But it is important to understand who is not going to accept these costs for the country or for the political leaders. Political leaders might ignore costs for the country, continue their policy and politics. Look at the Chancellor Merz. Everybody keeps on saying, how is it possible? The German economy is suffering. Energy is expensive, green protection costs are high. Can you imagine that Chancellor Merz leaves, will be shamed, and then he becomes CEO of Rheinmetall? Can you understand what bonuses he'll get till the end of his life for those contracts that he gave to Rheinmetall company? Who cares about German voters, German economy? That's what we need to think about. Quite clear. Mr. Lau?
Thanks, Chair. Professor Lee. I know you didn't say that by intention, but I have to correct you. Taiwan is not a country. It's a province of China. Okay. I'd like to make use of this time to make some comments about the future possibilities of the BRICS. We have talked a lot about BRICS, but one thing I think we should try to do is that we should try to find the real common interests of the members of this mechanism. Now it's a quite popular mechanism, but if you remember, the name of BRICS was coined by an American. You remember that? So BRICS countries are quite diversified. China, Russia, India, South Africa, quite diversified. They are quite different from each other. We do not share like similar religion, like similar ideology, which can naturally bond us together. So it's really important for BRIC countries to think what's the unique, what's the defining features of this mechanism or platform or whatever you call it. Only by this can we establish sort of an identity of this cooperative mechanism. And the second, we need to, I echoed one of my colleagues, I forgot his name, we need to sort of institutionalize this cooperation. We need to have some kind of secretariat, some kind of rules, some kind of dispute resolution mechanism, so that we can really make our cooperation, our dialogue, our possible integration, if I may say, more efficient and more feasible. That's what I want to add to my previous presentation. Thanks.
Спасибо. Время.
Thank you very much. The time for our panel discussion is over. At the end of this panel discussion, I'd like to thank, on behalf of our panel discussion, the organizers of Primakov Readings for very relevant, interesting question, which have been part of all these discussions. I'd like to congratulate the Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences on the 70th